It seems to me likely that when the high priest had his retainers bring Jesus before him, we don't know if it was an official trial, a proper court, that's very difficult to decide, but when the high priest confronted Jesus, the sequence of thought begins with Jesus' action in the temple. That's really what has precipitated this whole thing. Jesus has done and said things which make it look as though he thinks the temple is going to be judged by God and demolished. And naturally, for the high priest, the temple's his power base. That's where he is what he is. This is pretty devastating stuff. So we've got a head-to-head. The place isn't big enough for both of them. It's either Jesus, with his vision that the temple is going to be destroyed as a great act of judgment, and he and his movement are going to be vindicated, or it's the high priest sitting here with the temple as his power base, and this is how God is operating. And once you've got that picture, the rest of it follows. Because Jesus doesn't answer his question about the temple. And so the high priest cranks the thing up a notch. Because if Jesus is really pronouncing the doom of the temple, he may just be a wacky prophet, but it's likely that he thinks he's the Messiah, because ever since David planned the temple and Solomon built it, it's the Messiah who has authority over the temple. And here we play into a bit of tricky Judaism stuff as to whether the chief priest or the king is really the supreme authority. See, there's a bit of that in there as well. So he says, okay, if you're not going to talk about the temple, do you think you're the Messiah? And Jesus says, yes. And he backs it up with a double quotation from Daniel chapter 7, from Psalm 110. Both of those are texts he's already referred to in Mark's Gospel and elsewhere, and texts which, of course, become significant for the early church. Psalm 110 is precisely about a king who is superior to priests and who ends up sitting at God's right hand. Daniel 7 is about the suffering representative of God's people who, after his suffering, is vindicated, coming on the clouds, not in a return, but in an upward movement of vindication. Put those together in this dense little saying in Mark chapter 14, and I suspect that the conversation went on a lot longer between Jesus and Caiaphas, but Mark has no doubt shortened it, and this is what you get. You will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, that's Psalm 110, and coming on the clouds of heaven, that's Daniel 7, which is a way of saying, yes, the temple is going to be destroyed, and that will be part of my vindication. Yes, I am the Messiah, and God will exalt me as such. Yes, I, Jesus, am in the right, and you, Caiaphas, are in the wrong. And that when I am vindicated, and I take that to refer to the resurrection, ascension, destruction of the temple, and ultimately the second coming way off in the future, when I am vindicated, this will be the fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel about the coming of God's kingdom. You see, Josephus tells us at one point in his writings that many Jews in the middle of the 1st century AD were relying on a particular prophecy in their scriptures which said that at that time a world ruler would arise from Judea. Now, I have argued in my writings that that must be the book of Daniel, because that's the only book that has a specific time sequence, and we know that they calculated how that was going to pan out from Daniel chapter 9, but also chapters 2 and 7. Jesus, I believe, is plugging right into that exercise in guesswork and saying, you want to know when it's happening in and around me, my movement, my death, my vindication. And that is enough for Caiaphas to say, blasphemy. He thinks that God is vindicating him to his right hand. He thinks he's sharing God's throne. What can this be except blasphemy? That's how I think the trial sequence works, even though I'm quite sure, as I say, that in Mark we've just got a little bit like that, and I suspect it went on a lot longer.